Good afternoon. My name is Helen Miller and I am Assistant Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on 26 October 2017. This virtual meeting is being hosted from the GRI Secretariat Office in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buch, Director Standards, Laura Espiner, Manager Standards, Anna Grotova, Manager Standards, Jillian Balaban, Assistant Standards, and Pamela Carpio, Senior Coordinator, Governance Relations. We will now start with a roll call. Dwight Justice. Dwight, are you on the line? I'll continue. Evan Harvey.
I'm on the line. Hello.
Judy Kuczewski.
Yes, I'm here.
Julia Wilson.
Present.
Jürgen Buxbaum.
Yes, I'm here.
Ken Swift.
Yes, I'm here.
Kirsten Margrethe Hovey.
Present.
Michelle Vacher.
Yes, present.
Nankumar Vadakipat.
Present. Thank you.
Robin Leeson.
Yes, I'm on the line.
Stian Vandrach.
I'm on the line. Good afternoon.
Sulema Pioli.
Hello, present.
And I'll try again. Dwight Justice. Okay, we're reaching out to him now. Thank you, everyone. We would like to note that GSSB members Daniel Ingram, Attila Yelikaya, and Daniel Taiyang send their apologies to this meeting. I'll now hand to the chair, Judy Kuczewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Helen, and hello to all members who have made the time to join us today. Thank you very much for being here, and welcome to any of our stakeholders who may be listening in on the webcast at the moment. I trust that you have all had a chance to review and to download and take a quick look at the meeting materials, we are joined obviously by the Standards Division team members who will help to talk us through our agenda today. May I ask, first of all, whether there are any questions or concerns about the agenda for today's call, so that we are all clear about what we're trying to accomplish today. Any questions about that? Hearing none. The first item on our agenda is to approve the meeting summary from our in-person meeting from the 20th and 21st of September. Obviously, as an in-person meeting, it's a longer meeting summary than our virtual meetings. Do we have any comments, corrections, or questions about the material in that summary?
Kirsten here.
Yes, please go ahead, Kirsten.
Yes, I have two comments. The first is to the lengthiness of the minutes. I know I have taken this up several times, and others have too. I think it is important to try to make the summaries as short and relevant as possible. 14 pages minutes is quite a lot, and it's more difficult to find what is really material in that minutes. The second question, our second comment, is to line 234. It says that the Standards Division to rework the work program and submit for a formal resolution in the October meeting. I might have problems in, I don't know if it's me, but I was not able to see it in the minutes. So I suppose, no, in the agenda for today. So I suppose that it isn't there. Is that correct?
This is Bastian. Yes, Kirsten, that is correct. It was indeed, well, the Standards Division committed in the in-person meeting to submit that for the October meeting. But we have currently a couple of developments around, in particular, the sector program that we still want to render into a publicly approved work program. And we will update you in the November call about these developments and whether they will have an impact on what we have discussed in the in-person meeting. Hence, Julie and I have decided to not put this for a formal resolution in this meeting. It will come up in the next one.
Okay, thank you. I'm fine with that. And then I suppose that will be included in the minutes from this meeting.
Yes. Thank you, Kirsten. Any other comments? Any other members with comments or questions? If not, I would like to move on to the next bit of our agenda. We have in your meeting materials, item 2, we have an overview of dates for GSSB meetings in 2018. As you recall, we began this process in September in our in-person meeting and have done some further discussion and revisitation of dates. We are trying to ensure that our meeting dates, among other things, will be properly aligned with board meetings so that they don't all come on top of each other and there's enough time for the staff and for those of us who might be responsible for going to a number of these things to be able to do things in between the meetings. So there's been a little bit of adjustment of some of the dates. Bastian, would you like to say anything about the proposed calendar of meetings?
Maybe the only thing that needs to be said here is that we've followed up on a couple of the inputs that were given during the in-person meeting. In particular, we had the comment from Judy that we shouldn't overlay GSSB and GI board meetings if possible. So we've looked at that with this proposal. There were also comments about the OECD events in June and the UN human rights events in December. And for what we know right now, since these dates have not been set yet firmly in the schedules, we are avoiding this as well. You're seeing that we've also, for the in-person meeting, the first one in next year, we've opted for the April date that was proposed during the in-person meeting. I think at least one GSB member was favoring that, and others weren't opposed to that solution. And we had back then promised to go back to the project planning and see and how far this would have a material effect on how we were laying out the projects. So in short, I think we were able to accommodate most of the feedback. It might very well be that next year we will have to reschedule either the June or potentially the November call, because that might still then collide with the mentioned meetings at the OECD or the UN in Geneva. Just one note, there is a mistake in the file. It's not Thursday 30th of November, it's Thursday 29th of November. It is corrected on the slides, but just wanted to mention that when you transpose these dates, if they get approved now into your diaries. So it is the Thursday that we're looking for in November as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Bastian. So I think obviously there are a lot of dates here, and everybody will have to take a look at your calendars to slot these things in. And obviously there may be things that change between now and the middle of next year, for example, that affect your ability to attend any one of these things. I would just like to put it out to the GSSB to please flag at the moment whether you have significant concerns about the proposed timing, and whether there's anything that we need to know now about availability that affects the overall sort of GSSB calendar for next year. I hope that we have already identified some of these bigger issues, but if anyone has any concerns about any of this, would you kindly share those now? Hearing none, I hope that means that we have now a proposed calendar for next year, and we can go ahead and schedule those meetings. Clearly, some members will be able to attend some things and not other things, but hopefully this is a calendar that will largely work for the group. If there are no further discussion points on any of those, I'd like now to ask Anna and Laura to talk us through. We have the public comment period, which has closed for the water and occupational health and safety standards revisions. And we'd like to hear a little bit about some of the themes from the public comment period. It will be a while yet in kind of doing the deep analysis, but at the moment it would be very useful for the GSSB to understand what users and reviewers have been saying about the proposed changes to those standards, so that we can be thinking about what the final resolution may have to look like. So I don't know which one of you, Anna or Laura, might be going first on these, but I'll hand it over to you and welcome your thoughts for the GSSB.
Thank you, Judy. This is Laura Spinac, and I'll be kicking off this session. As Judy said, the aim of the session is to share a brief update on the outcome of the public comment period, which closed on the 9th of October for the occupational health and safety and the water and effluence standards. We'll share some stats on the level of engagement and participation in the public comment, the summary of the main themes from the feedback, and then we will close by looking at the next steps and the project timeline. So for occupational health and safety, last month we presented an update on the activities that we were conducting as part of the public comment period. And since then, we have completed all of the activities that we had set out to do, and we're quite pleased with the level of engagement that we have had. So in total, we engaged with 130 participants in the regional workshops, nearly 200 participants in the live webinars that we conducted. The recorded webinar, which we had available on the website, was quite popular with more than 700 views. More than 1,200 people visited the project page, and about half of those downloaded the draft standard. In total, we have received 55 submissions from organizations and individuals, which were submitted either through the consultation platform, online, or via email. 78% of the submissions were made on behalf of an organization, and 22% on behalf of an individual. In terms of the constituency breakdown, the majority of the submissions have come in from business and report practitioners, so we're very happy to have had a lot of practical feedback on the clarity and feasibility of the disclosures. 15% came in from civil society, 11% from mediating institutions, 5% from labor, and 18% from other categories. And it's important to point out that we did not receive any feedback from the investment community. In terms of the regional breakdown of the submissions, this is fairly representative of the population of GRI reporters and very comparable to other public comment periods that we have conducted. So we have received feedback from all regions of the world, with the majority coming from Europe and North America. Between these 55 submissions, they have made nearly 600 individual comments. So we're quite pleased with the level of engagement and participation, and also with the quality of the comments that have been made. They've been really excellent, with very clear rationales and concrete proposals for changes to the draft. In terms of the methodology that we have followed to analyze the feedback, first we looked at the quantitative responses to the questionnaire that we had available on the platform, and which we will share with you in a moment. We've done a qualitative analysis of all of the comments received via the platform and by email. All comments have been categorized by theme, and they have been reviewed by at least 2 members of the GRI Standards Division to ensure that the categorization was correct. We have also analyzed the feedback coming through the workshops, which has been aggregated and anonymized, and that feedback has been used to supplement the official feedback from the platform and by email. In general, what we have seen is that respondents are very supportive of the draft standard, and they've indicated that it is a significant improvement over the previous standard. There's been many comments made suggesting improvements and additional content to be added, but again, many of these suggestions for improvement have been made in the context of this is a very positive and significant improvement, and also very important to note that there's been no fundamental flaws or critical flaws raised by respondents. Many of the comments are about fine-tuning, providing more guidance, examples, or revisiting the status of some of the disclosures into requirements or recommendations. Important to note as well that many comments are minority comments, meaning that they have been made by only 1 or 2 respondents. However, we have evaluated every single comment made based on its own merits, although that has inevitably required a lot of judgment on our part to balance the suggested change by 1 respondent with the fact that the rest of respondents did not suggest any changes. So we've done our best to try and identify those minority comments that would be critical to implement, but we will be working with the working group in the coming weeks to ensure that that assessment is correct. And finally, at the moment, we're expecting that we would need to re-expose at least 1 of the disclosures on the number of high potential incidents, and perhaps 1 or 2 other metrics, and we will come to that again later in the presentation. In terms of the main themes of feedback, here you can see the responses to the questions in the questionnaire. We had 6 general questions around the feasibility, relevance, clarity, and completeness of the disclosures, and then 4 specific content questions on the scope of workers, the management approach, the high potential incidents, and the work-related illnesses for workers who are not employees. As you can see, for many of the questions, there is a slight majority of respondents who sit in the no camp, although we would need to caveat this very strongly, because when we went back to see what respondents have said in relation to a no response, we found that a no response included a very wide range of responses, from disagreement with the totality of the draft to disagreement with just 1 disclosure or 1 element of 1 disclosure. In some cases, a no was selected, but no written comment was left, or the written comment left had nothing to do with the question being asked. So these results are important for us to look at, but they cannot be extrapolated, and they cannot be taken as a strong indication for support or lack of support for the standard. And we've learned again that having very general questions with a wide scope covering the entirety of the contents in the draft is perhaps not the most helpful approach. So we will be revisiting that going forward. In terms of the main themes that have come up through the feedback, one of the most critical themes has been on the clarity and feasibility of the scope of workers. Many respondents have asked to clarify and provide more explanations and examples for which workers should be included in the scope. Important to note that there's been no concerns or disagreement with the definitions of employee and worker per se, or with the criteria of control of work and control of workplace. The comments have been more about providing additional guidance, support, and examples to reporters. Many respondents have said that reporting data for workers who are not employees is quite challenging, and in particular, reporting work-related illnesses, all recordable injuries, and the number of hours work was considered to be particularly challenging, and also reporting any kind of quantitative data for workers under shared control was also found very challenging. Reporting work-related illnesses was also found very challenging in general, not only for workers but also for employees. And they mentioned different elements of this that would be particularly challenging. So long latency illnesses was one of the examples given, and also the fact that it is very difficult to determine whether the illness has been caused by a work-related factor, because many times there are different factors contributing to the illness, and also psychosocial or mental illnesses would be very difficult to report, since this is largely based on self-disclosure, and in many instances that is protected by healthcare privacy regulations. There's been suggestions made to revise some of the disclosures on high potential incidents and the two disclosures on the percentage of workers with access to occupational health services and worker health promotion programs. So in general, what we've seen is that respondents are in agreement with the overall intent of these concepts, but they believe that there's probably better metrics to capture the impacts or performance that is trying to communicate. So in the case of high potential incidents, respondents said that the concept is unclear and subjective, which would make information not really comparable. And also that this metric could potentially penalize those companies with good recording systems, although that rationale has also been said for reporting injuries in general. And for the other two disclosures on access, whilst respondents think that it is important to ensure access to those services, some think that most companies will simply report 100% of access, and that information alone would not be very meaningful. We have received many suggestions for additional content and topics to be added to the standard. So in particular, respondents wanted to see more leading indicators included in the draft, such as on rates of training or frequency of audits or inspections. But we have not seen any clear trend on which leading indicator would be supported by a majority of respondents. And new topics that respondents wanted to see included were around gender, nutrition, road safety, commuting, public safety, etc. And finally, respondents have also asked to clarify some of the more technical concepts on hazards, the hierarchy of controls, recordable injuries and illnesses, and impairments. As mentioned earlier, we do expect the need to re-expose some of the contents, at least the metric on high potential incidents, but potentially one or two more other metrics. In the GSSB due process protocol, the need for re-exposure is to be assessed during the final approval of the standard, which now we expect to be in April of 2018. However, we would propose that we do not wait until April to re-expose those contents, because we're confident that in the next few weeks we can work together with the working group to revise those contents and to put them out for re-exposure much earlier. So we have a proposal for re-exposure that we want to share with you for your comments today, but it's important to note that this approach would not replace the requirement in the due process to reassess the need for re-exposure during the final approval of the standard. So even if we decide to go ahead with this approach, the GSSB would still have the option to vote for re-exposure in April. So our approach would be that whenever we make a significant change to a disclosure or to a requirement which has been supported by a large number of respondents, we would propose that we go ahead to make that change without the need for re-exposure. However, whenever we're making a significant change to a requirement based on a minority comment, we would propose that those contents be published for re-exposure. So with the example of the high potential incidents, many respondents suggested to revise the disclosure. However, only very few respondents proposed concrete alternatives. And those alternatives, if we were to implement them, would need to be tested with the public. We will propose the re-exposure to go for 45 days between December of this year and January of 2018. We would post the contents on the GRI Standards website and announce the re-exposure through GRI's regular communication channels. And we would specifically invite all of those who have participated in this public comment to give feedback. We have a question for you on whether you would be supportive of this approach, but before that I wanted to show how that would fit in the overall timeline for this project. So we would be working with the working group to make those changes in the coming weeks, so that at the next GSSB meeting in November we can share a draft of the revised contents, and then we would look for the GSSB to approve those contents for re-exposure by email in early December. The re-exposure would stretch from December until end of January, and at the GSSB call in February we would be able to share the outcome of that re-exposure with you, with the aim of presenting the final draft or final standard for approval to you for the April meeting. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Judy, to solicit any comments from the GSSB, first on the approach to re-exposure, and then on any other comments or questions on the summary of the feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Can I ask for you to just clarify, when you use the term selective re-exposure, the thing that is selective about it is that there will only be certain proposed disclosures that will be re-exposed. Yes, it's not that it will be re-exposed to a selective audience or anything like that. It's a limitation on what portion of the proposed new standard will be re-exposed. Yes?
That's correct. So anyone, any interested party could give feedback on the revised content, even those who have not participated in this public comment.
Fine, thank you. I have a question from Sulema. Please go ahead, Sulema Pioli.
Thank you, Judy.
I have a question too.
I'm not seeing the presentation anymore. I'm having some problems with the Skype for Business, but I can hear you clear, loud and clear. And because I was off for 2 or 3 minutes, I'm not sure if I fully understood what will be re-exposed, because the health and safety standard and the water standard are parts of one of them or parts of both.
Okay, Sulema, I also had a little bit of a connection problem, but at the moment we're just talking about the occupational health and safety standard.
Oh, okay.
And there is one proposed. Laura, could you possibly just repeat what the topic was that has come up in the public comment process, which has thrown up a proposed disclosure that ought to be tested through further public comment, please?
Sure. So the one metric where we're pretty certain that we will need re-exposure is the number of high potential incidents. But there's probably one or two other metrics that could also be re-exposed, although I need to caveat that we still need to share this feedback with the working group and to validate the public comments and the alternative options with them before we can give a clear indication of whether there is a need for re-exposure and which specific contents will be put out for re-exposure. So this is at the moment just our best guess, but we need to validate that with the working group next week.
Okay, so the content will be discussed with the working group, right?
Yes, next week. So you're the first ones to be getting this preview.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you. Dwight, you indicated that you wanted to speak.
I was just wanted to understand the process. So basically, has the working group already received the input from the exposure?
No, they will be getting that next Tuesday.
And then what would be their role in determining how to adopt the input?
So next Tuesday, we will be sharing a detailed overview of the public comments. After that, they will get the full set of comments, our summary of it, and our proposed changes to the draft. And they will have a couple of weeks to go through that and to give us their comments. On the 20th of November, we will be discussing their comments on our proposed actions. And at that point is when we can take a decision on whether and which contents would go out for re-exposure. And then we can give you an update on how those discussions are developing at the next GSSB meeting in November. So that's the sequence of events that we have planned at the moment. Okay,
thanks.
Okay, I have a question in the chat box from Kirsten Margrethe Hoefy. Is my understanding correct that we will see the proposals for re-exposure in the complete context, including those topics that are not for re-exposure? Can you answer that one, Laura?
We can definitely do that, although at that point in time, we might not be able to update the draft in its totality. Our main focus is going to be to rework those metrics that would go for re-exposure, but we could definitely provide those in the context of the full draft, with the caveat that the rest of the contents are still under development. But what we would propose is that we only put out those contents that have changed for re-exposure, so as to not give the public the option to reopen other issue areas.
Right. Okay. In the interests of not making excessive work for the standards division, can I suggest that, Laura, that you and your team sort of go back and look at what can you do easily to provide the GSSB with as much context as possible without having to sort of rework too many documents yourselves, and take it from there? Does that sound okay?
Yeah, we will do that. And also these metrics that are likely going to change are quite independent from the rest of the contents. And that's one of the reasons why we're proposing this selective re-exposure, because there's no connection or related methodologies elsewhere in the document. So those contents can be assessed in isolation from the rest of the document.
Thank you very much. I've got a question from Robin Leeson. Would you like to go ahead, Robin?
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Laura, for the presentation and all of the hard work on the comment period. I just had what I hope might be a quick question. I understand you talked a bit about some of the learnings from the questions, the way they were framed, that some of the results and the feedback was sort of influenced by the way the questions were asked, and that you might do things differently. I did just want to know with the questions such as question 2 and question 3 about the feasibility of the disclosures to all organisations and the clarity of the content, and there were quite relatively high responses to that in terms of it potentially not being feasible for organisations to report, or there was an influence there, and there was a no under the clarity question. I was wondering with the feedback that you got, if there's a sense of which constituency groups were providing that feedback. So I'm just interested to know, is it sort of practitioners from the business constituency that are mostly responding no to that question, or is it from civil society or a different constituency group? And that may not be a question you can answer at this stage, but I think it's something that you might be able to reflect on if you can remember some of the different kinds of responses.
Sure. So from what we recall, most of those no responses to feasibility and clarity came in from the business constituency, although half of the responses come from the business constituency. So you need to look at that in perspective. The Labour constituency was very positive about the changes proposed in the draft, and in some cases they wanted to see even more included in the draft. And very similarly for the civil society organization constituency, most of the comments related to clearly including certain contents or vulnerable workers in the draft standards. So yeah, we can say that the majority of comments around feasibility and clarity came from the reporting practitioners.
This is Bastian, just to add to Laura's commentary. I think it is important to highlight that the questions that were chosen were really, especially the first ones, were really broad in scope, and whenever there was disagreement with an aspect of the overall draft, that would render a no response. And I think the verdict is still out whether we should be asking the questions in that way. And I think there are two observations to be made in that regard. One is you can think of the survey, the questionnaire that we're putting out, as a way of triggering stakeholders to look at the draft from different perspectives, and that's actually something we see when you look at the overall feedback. Sometimes they carry through feedback very diligently, and they repeat for every question basically the same thing. Others actually work. You can see that they work with the draft, and while initially they say no, then they to the feasibility, they later on offer very pointed feedback for oftentimes just a small aspect of the overall draft, and tell us how to improve it. So it generates probably a more diverse set and a more nuanced set of feedback, this approach. On the other hand, we are faced with what you're going through now with us, is an interpretation of a no response, and trying to figure out, is that a firm no that applies across the board to all the contents, or in actual fact what we're seeing and now for this particular instance, that oftentimes the stakeholders ticked no and had a very specific comment on one of the many disclosures. So we will see. We will still see how going forward we will address that. What you see with other standard setters is oftentimes that they use a set of questions as well. But what they actually react to is the individual comments or also the set of comments, and they take those at face value and respond to the substantive comment rather than what is coming out of these questions as a quantitative or aggregated response.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions from the GSSB? Okay, I don't hear any. Thank you very much to the Standards Division for talking us through all of that, and we look forward to the next steps from the working groups meeting next week. The second summary of public feedback is on the exposure draft of water and effluents. Anna, would you like to talk us through that?
Yes, very much, Judy. Thank you. And let me directly move to the numbers and feedback we have received to the water and effluents draft, and I will have to skip a lot of the similar content that Laura has presented already. So this is an overview of the final numbers of stakeholders we have involved in the public comment activities. As you can see, these numbers are largely similar to numbers for occupational health and safety, with an exception that there were slightly more participants engaged in workshops, as we've held an additional workshop in Colombia and a dedicated workshop at the World Water Week in Stockholm, which is accounted for here. Of course, our, sorry, excuse me, we have some, bear with me for a second. I will move on as we bring the presentation back to the right slide, but our main channel for collecting feedback was the public consultation platform, and we received a total of 46 submissions. An additional 8 respondents have sent their feedback via email, submitted largely on behalf of organizations. And of these, 2 submitted feedback through the platform, and we excluded these numbers from the number of official feedback received. So overall, the total number of submissions was 52 for the water draft. And to put it in perspective, for the transition from guidelines to standards, the standard division received about 100 submissions. So we consider these to be quite good numbers for topic-specific standards. And in total, these 52 users submitted over 500 comments, which created quite a comprehensive base for our analysis. As you can see, the majority of stakeholders submitted feedback on behalf of organizations. The feedback was mainly submitted by companies, while we also had a good number of experts commenting from civil society organizations. There were also a few users who chose not to identify themselves with any of the GRI constituencies, and these included, for example, research institutions or academia. And finally, as was foreseen, more than half of the participants represented Europe, followed by Northern America, Asia, Latin America, and Africa and Oceania. The methodology for analyzing feedback was the same for occupational health and safety, which I won't repeat. The only difference was that we have also looked at feedback received through reporting mock-up exercises. And for those of you who missed the GSSB September meeting, this exercise included a comprehensive review and discussions of proposed disclosures by 4 selected companies if they were to begin reporting on these disclosures immediately. And these companies have specifically asked us not to disclose their feedback in the public domain, but it has largely reaffirmed official feedback and served a great deal for the standards division to understand and delve into the specifics of industry processes or operation companies operation contexts for companies from various sectors. The analysis of this feedback brought us to the following conclusions. So overall and in general, respondents were supportive of the draft standard and indicated that it is a significant improvement over the previous standard. However, most of the commentary was focused on the presentation of the contents. And to explain, the disclosures in the current draft are quite complex in that they combine multiple subtopics under one disclosure, and some of these are more aspirational than others. And it was largely reporters who reacted to this complexity and asked to present the contents in a more accessible way. So these requests would imply substantive changes in the structure of the standards and may require re-exposure of significant portions of the draft. If so, re-exposure timeline will depend on whether the project working group can come to consensus about which contents need to be re-exposed, and will either open in December or later in January 2018. And in case of the latter, the timeline for release of the standard will need to be reviewed by the GSSB. Similar to occupational health and safety project, the public comment for water included a survey with a range of questions that yielded a wide scope of answers. And similarly, we've learned that in the future we will need to reformulate these to be more specific. So for example, you can see that majority of respondents to question 3 replied that that there are some contents that are unclear, but the comments that they left were repetitive of their responses to questions that we've asked about additional guidance or any other information that or suggestions that they had to the draft. We have also asked a number of specific questions that gave us quite a clear direction about the changes that we need to make. So for example, it is clear if you look at question 10 that there is a strong tilt towards reporting discharge by quality rather than by treatment. And this is what we hope to understand better as the result of the survey. But I'd now like to move on to an overview of the bigger changes that we anticipate. So the first main theme that we have identified concerns the feasibility of reporting substances of concern. The current standard does not specify how these can be defined, so many respondents flagged that they will not be able to report required data for all substances of concern for which they treat their discharges, as suggested by the current formulation of the requirement. So this would include as well discharge limits set for each substance, an explanation of how they are set, and performance against the limits. Respondents explained that their substances of concern vary significantly across sites and countries and are defined by regulatory requirements or standards that are specific to each of these countries or sites. So they would simply not be able to aggregate this information at a company-wide scale. Also, they flagged that whether a substance should be considered of concern depends largely on the profiles of the receiving body where it is discharged to, which we're currently not asking in the standard. So even if a company would be able to compile the requested data, the result would be a list of hundreds of substances of concern with various discharge limits, which would not tell meaningful information about the impacts that these substances have on the environment. So at a minimum, a clarification or definition of substances of concern is needed, and we will be putting other proposals on how to report against this disclosure to the project working group. The other group of comments was received around feasibility of reporting value chain data, and companies continue to repeat that they cannot measure quantitative information about impacts of withdrawals, consumption, and discharge by their suppliers, simply because their supply chains span thousands of suppliers. And I'd like to clarify that it is currently a recommendation in the standards which sets out to report this quantitative information, which sets out aspirational practices and leadership examples, which was specifically included by the working group to start to shift the status quo in supply chain reporting and impact management. But companies seem to have misunderstood that this is in fact a recommendation and not a requirement, and hence they can omit it if they wish. So in light of this distinction between quantitative and qualitative information in the disclosure, a few comments were made that this contradicts the logic and structure of the standard, and so that any narrative information should be moved to the management approach. Another set of comments was made with respect to reducing the complexity of the structure of the standard and breaking it up or breaking its content into separate disclosures to make reporting for companies slightly easier. So first of all, this concerns disclosure 3031 on water withdrawals and consumption, which currently requests information on both withdrawals and consumption in one disclosure. In addition, to calculate water consumption, we have recommended a method which subtracts discharges from withdrawals, meaning that companies also need to compile their water discharge information if they do not measure consumption directly. And so looking at feedback, this has proven to be quite an effort for some companies to compile all three pieces for this one disclosure, and so they suggested to break it up into withdrawals, consumption, and discharge. Following my previous comment about the structure of the value chain disclosure, participants suggested to move all narrative information which currently sits in the requirements to the management approach disclosures and move quantitative information, which is in the reporting recommendations, to relevant disclosures in the standards without changing their status. And finally, respondents suggested to consider removing disclosure on spills and leaks from the standard completely, as in some jurisdictions, spills and leaks are subject to incident reporting and should therefore be covered by a separate standard. Finally, respondents suggested to add additional content and clarifications in the standard. And the first suggestion that I'd like to bring to your attention, in fact, was made by only 2 respondents, but we found it to be a very valid argument. And these respondents say that while the standard focuses on measuring withdrawals and consumption from water-stressed areas, it does not carry that link throughout the whole standards to also look at whether water discharge are made to sensitive locations. And without this piece, the full understanding of impacts of water use would not be complete. The other comments were made with respect to clarifying existing content by providing more guidance, examples, and background information. First of all, respondents have asked to better clarify or define the term third-party water and provide guidance on how and to what extent companies need to measure impacts of water that comes from third-party suppliers or that is discharged to third-party. They've asked to add additional guidance and indicators to identify water-stressed areas. They've asked to better define what significant spills and leaks are, as this is very much open to interpretation. They've also asked to provide more guidance on what significant impacts from spills and leaks can be. And finally, while many participants commented about the feasibility of reporting quantitative data in the recommendations to the value chain disclosure, they said that with a clear definition of a scope of supply chain and better criteria for defining significant suppliers, they will be able to provide narrative information about impacts. So this feedback, yes, you're on the right slide. So with this feedback, it is clear that there is a need for re-exposure to some extent, and we will follow the same approach as for occupational health and safety. But as we anticipate substantive change in the format and structure of the standard, we will have to carefully look at the discussions we will have with the project working group in October and November to see if they can arrive at consensus by December around the context that they want re-exposed. And if these discussions will require more time, then we will re-expose in January, in which case, as I've said, the implications for timeline need to be further assessed with the GSSB. So on the next slide, if the project working group agrees on contents for re-exposure by December, then we will follow the same timeline as for occupational health and safety, where we will re-expose portions of the standard for 45 days between December and January, and we'll present the final standard for your approval at the April meeting. But if the project working group needs more time, then we will re-expose in January, and we will have to reassess whether the re-exposure will need to be for longer than 45 days or not. But in this case, we will have feedback ready to present to you from public comment for your meeting in March, and the final standard release date will have to be reassessed. So preceding any comments, we have not yet consulted any of this with the project working group. Similar to HNS, we will have our first meeting next Monday where we will present our suggestions, and it will be then up to them to discuss and decide which of these points they think are valid and which content they want re-exposed. But at the moment, nothing agreed on. Judy, I'd like to turn it over to you to let the GSSB members react to this feedback.
Thank you very much, Anna. Just for information, Michel Wascher has included a comment, a written comment. For information, Solvay was one of the companies involved in the reporting mock-up exercise. He says, I left full freedom to our HSE department to make the comments they believed useful. So I take it, Michel, that means that their comments are their own and may be the same or different from your comments, just like any other participant. Do we have any questions or comments from the GSSB members further to the information that Anna has just shared with us?
It's Michel Wascher here. Just to explain a bit my comment. Yes, as a sustainability professional, I may sometimes be more ambitious in disclosure than what our department may want to do. I believe that is perfectly normal. I also believe that in the GSSB, I'm not just there to advocate for my company. I'm also there to help standards evolve. And so, depending on the discussions that are done within the GSSB, I may have an opinion which is different from other people in our company. But for the feedback to be meaningful, it shouldn't go through me and be modified.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Michel. Any members care to raise any questions or comments about this feedback? I'm going to give a moment for the for any written comments to come in. So there is a written comment from Robin Leeson. Question: does the selective additional disclosure influence the proposal on effluents? Anna, do you have an answer to that?
I'm not sure I understand the question correctly. So the contents on effluents are still in the draft for water and effluents, and they will remain there, and they will continue to be there, even after re-exposure. Okay, Robin, does that answer your question? Did you want to add anything further to it?
Yeah. Just really quickly, there was in the minutes from our last face-to-face meeting that there would be something on something additional on effluent coming to the November meeting.
I can clarify. So what we suggested is that we would present a proposal at your November meeting for revising the waste standard, or what's left of the waste standard, as all the effluents disclosures have migrated to the water standard, and that still remains true, and we are aiming to get the proposal to you for the November meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Any other questions or comments from GSSB? Okay, hearing none, I think thank you very much for that, Anna. And we can now move on quickly to the next item on our agenda, technical inquiries. Bastian, could you please tell us something about that?
Yes, thank you, Judy. So this is the standing item that we have in all the calls, and it is just an overview that we provide to the GSSB of the inquiries received during a certain time period. Today, we're presenting the contents for August and September, and I think if I had to paraphrase what it is that we're bringing to you today, is there are two important things. One is it is on average more of the same. So the contents that we have particularly discussed in the in-person meeting now around in accordance, the transition to the standards and when the standards become mandatory, sector disclosures, the notification element or requirement in the standards and how to comply with it. So we're receiving similar feedback, and as you well know, we will have at least some of the responses available based on discussions that we had in September and FAQs that we will approve with you in November. In interest of time, I think there is not one, and then that was also stated in the paper that we provided, item 3. There's not one particular inquiry that we would like to single out at this point in time. We will get back to you in the next meeting with the FAQ responses, and this is where the more substantive comments will probably then have to be looked at again, and whether you feel that our draft responses are in light of the discussions in September, but also in terms of what we're seeing as continued inquiries to the standards division adequate to at least put some line of response out there. We will struggle, of course, as you know, to provide definite responses to all of these issues. But for most of the ones that we're currently seeing, we can induce some clarity. Thank you. Maybe the only question to the GSB is whether there was something in the summary that you would like to put on a list for discussion at a later stage.
Yes, please. That's what I was going to ask for the GSSB. If, having looked at the list of technical queries in this summary, you have anything that's come to your attention that you think is that needs a specific discussion and review by the GSSB, please would you let us know? This is obviously not your only opportunity to do that, but if there are any of those that you would like to raise now, please do. Okay, well, hearing none, I will return to our agenda, to the next item. We have discussed the desire to put together a code of conduct for the development of GRI standards, and we've been given a draft proposal here. And I will go back to Bastian at this point to talk us a little bit through what's contained in this. Where did it come from? What's it intended to do? And what does it contain? Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. So this is following up on a discussion we had in the September meeting, where the GSB instructed us to look at formulating a code of conduct for the experts participating in our processes. This would be issued in addition to the guidance that we're giving them currently as part of the terms of reference for the group, and could be flagged up also whenever needed, probably, but certainly also at the beginning of the process, as a reminder what the expectation is towards professional conduct in a GI process. Where this is coming from is I think we looked at a couple of the references that were given in the September meeting, and we also try to bring in the link to our fairly unique in some ways due process, so that it is really rooted in what is set out in the GSB due process and the GSB terms of reference and so on. We've put this today for discussion because we didn't spend very much time on it in September. You gave us some global recommendations on what to look out for. What we're interested in today is whether you feel that what you're looking at here is complete, whether there are components missing, or whether the contents that are currently laid out need to change in any way. I assume that all members had the chance to read through it. The only other thing I would say is one of the learnings from looking through the guidance documents or code of conduct documents that others have developed is, in general, you see that there is an attempt to not micromanage the experts involved and not have guidelines of behavior, but rather keep it on the principle level. And that seems to be the right thing to do in this context. So we really have to look at how much more detailed, if there is a desire to do that, we want to get with this type of guidance. I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can just have, if there are any comments, that would be good to hear. And the aim would be to come with a final version for approval in November.
Thank you, Bastian. Any discussion of this from the GSSB now? Anything that you'd like to raise and discuss with your fellow members now in advance of that refinement and finalization for November? That would be welcome. I'm not hearing any. I think, Bastian, you can assume that we will continue to follow this process of refining the proposed code of conduct, and obviously there'll be more discussion of that as we go along.
Yeah. So just to that. So if there are any comments on this content, we would appreciate if you could send those to us. And this can be content on the comments on the existing content or other references that we should be looking at. But what we would try to do is actually to close this process in 2 weeks' time and share a document for approval with you. At which stage, I hope we're not reopening anything that we're seeing now. Because there was the opportunity to comment.
Thank you.
If there is anything, please submit it as soon as possible.
Thank you, Bastian. That is definitely worth flagging. Okay, so that does give us a timeline of the next 2 weeks or so to complete any kind of discussion of this topic. Is there any other business that hasn't been addressed so far that any members would like to raise before we close the public meeting? Okay, hearing none. Thank you very much to the Standards Division. Thank you to all who have attended this from wherever you might be. GSSB members have an informational briefing to come after we close the public session. But for now, it is time for us to do that and to say thank you to those who are listening in for joining us. And we will close the public session now. Thank you.